Yes, that's fine. I'm going to give it another few minutes for people to trickle in before we kick off. But thank you all for joining. I'm excited for today's session. It's going to be a good one. Yeah, I'll wait until there's kind of a pause in the request to join, and then we'll kick off. It's kind of like when you're making popcorn and you wait for the pops to stop for like 10 seconds, and then you can. It's safe.
Yeah, let things settle down a bit.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll kick things off now. I'm sure a few more people will join, but that's all right. Thank you all for joining. Like I said, my name is Taylor Brownlow. I'm head of data at Count. Count is a whiteboard for data. So if you can imagine kind of a SQL IDE, a BI tool, and a notebook into Miro, it's kind of what we are. We're running this session. This is the first of our metric tree operational clarity masterclass. So thank you guys for coming out. I wanted to, before we kick off with Ergest today, which is going to be a really great chat, I wanted to give a bit of background on the overall masterclass that we're running, why we're doing it, and maybe what you guys can expect over the next few weeks. I guess about a year ago, we started a Slack community for heads of data, just as a place where these heads of data could talk to each other, get advice, ask questions, just kind of, get some real advice from their peers. And a few months ago in that Slack community, we just started getting loads of questions and discussions around metric trees, which I'm sure you guys have all seen a lot of posts about it yourselves and have a lot of questions. And basically, the idea for this masterclass came out of a lot of the discussions that we were having in that group. And there are a lot of questions spanning the gamut from kind of what is a metric tree, what's the theory behind it, which we're going to be covering today, to really practical things like how do I start this project, how do I get approval, how do I build one, what tools do I use, what's available, as well as kind of, moving ahead, does this kind of open doors for how my data team should operate? So it's based on those questions that we created this masterclass session. There's 4 sessions. You guys are all first one. We have one on Thursday, which is going to be building a metric tree live. We have one next week with some data leaders from Bumble, Mubi, and Clio, and they've all built metric trees, and they're going to come tell their stories, talk about really practical things that they kind of wish they had known earlier. So that's going to be a really great session. And then next Thursday, we'll be meeting Ollie Hughes will be going through a lot of the research that he's done into how this idea of operational clarity can really unlock a different way of working for your data team. So, all that being said, you will get all the recordings for these after each session. We'll send out the calendar invites after each session, so you'll get the one for Thursday after today. And I'm also going to try to prepare some notes after each session as well, so you have kind of a summarized version of everything that we're building up throughout these 4 sessions. So hopefully you have a pretty good kind of summary list at the end of this. Okay, I think that's all the admin stuff I had written down to cover off. So we can get into today's session. So today we are talking with Ergest Xheblati. Is a blogger, hopefully you guys all know, an author and a consultant during the day. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the theory behind metric trees. So first of all, Ergest, thanks for joining. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, Taylor. Doing quite well. I'm excited about this session, given that metric trees has been a bit of an obsession of mine over the past couple of years since I got introduced to them. So very happy to share what I've learned so far, especially some of the connections to other concepts that I've made, and sort of the roots of where metric trees came from, kind of explain a little bit of that and some of the differences with a few other tools that people have encountered. Pretty stoked.
Yeah, me too. I think one of the things before we start that you said really well last time we spoke was just this fear of kind of metric trees becoming like memified, kind of because they're so big right now. They kind of could
Yeah.
lose their potency. And so I think this session in particular feels really important to avoid that, because as we kind of break down what is and isn't a metric tree, what are the kind of foundational principles behind it, I think it helps it stand on its own, not just as another hype cycle output. So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I can go into some details about kind of what I mean about that. So there's been a lot of concepts in the data space. I'm sure a lot of the people here are familiar with, data mesh, or this thing or that thing. And a lot of these concepts tend to sort of the pace of the spread of the concept itself sort of outstrips the benefits, or like the science, or the theory behind what brought it to fruition in the first place. And so I'm specifically worried. I'm particularly worried about this in with metric trees, because I don't want it to become, oh, here's this like thing, this tool, this cult that has a cult following, right? Like this thing that it's like a thing, and it's really not a thing. It's just it's basically it's a graphical representation of the business model, and the way that I think about it is, if you know the term fractal. So a fractal is something that repeats and multiple levels, both at the micro level and at the macro level. So I think of metric trees like a fractal, which is they can apply to one small department with a few people. You can build a metrics tree just that has like 2 or 3 levels that only applies to your team, where you have, your goal metric at the top, and then you have the other metrics that are associated with it. Or you can take it and apply it from that one department or group to the department, to eventually to the division, and all the way up to the company. And you can sort of keep going. It's the idea is that it's fractal. It repeats at multiple levels. But the thing that I wanted to sort of specify, or what I wanted to make super clear, is that uh, it's a graphical representation of the business, and so I personally don't care for labels, right? If you're kind of saying, oh, well, is this a KPI tree? Is this a metrics tree? Is this a that tree or that tree? To me, it doesn't matter. To me, it's all about, can you map your business, or the thing that you care about, the area that you have influence over? Can you map that into a graphical representation with the metrics that kind of give you a signal of, is it doing well? Is it not doing well? Right. That's kind of like one of the uses of the metric, and I'm sure we'll get into the specifics later on. But I just want to like that kind of circle this back. It's not that it's like a new thing. It's metric trees. It's basically, it's a graph. A tree is just a graph. It explains how 2 or 3 metrics are connected with each other. It could be connected through a mathematical formula, like a conversion rate times average order value gives you revenue, right? Or it could be some sort of a causal relationship. This metric causes that metric. Or it could be a correlational, when this metric increases, it tends to cause this other metric, not cause, but it sort of marches in step with this other metric, and so on and so forth. So it's like there's no set of rules or regulations or laws behind this thing. It's like you just map your business in a graphical way to to the truth. So that's
I think there's a few things that we should unpack. I think
Mhm.
Yeah, one of the first questions I was going to ask was around this definition of a metric tree. I think which you've touched on quite a bit there. I think one of the first questions that we got asked and from this community is like, oh, well, what's the difference between a KPI tree and a metric tree? And I think, yeah, it's very tempting to get kind of caught up in the differences between them. I think it's nice to reorient, as you say, to saying like, okay, the objective is to, can you map out how your business works?
Yeah,
I think,
call it whatever you like. If you
yeah,
want to call it a KPI tree, if that helps you sell it to your boss, by all means, call it a KPI tree. If they think in terms of KPIs, you think in terms of metrics, it's sort of the same thing. Key performance indicator has the like the additional aspect of it being key, as opposed to a metric is just a way to measure a specific thing. But yeah, I don't like to put like boundaries around what a metric tree is versus what a KPI tree is, and what are the the benefits and drawbacks of one versus the other.
yeah. I suppose one distinction, I think, that I'd be curious what you think about this. Certainly in my mind, anyway. A KPI tree, at least when I've seen them, tend to just be more like text-based, definitions rather than numerical values attached to them. And I think one of the main kind of the value points that we'll get into, I think you also use the word diagnostic as well. Like, can you use this to diagnose issues? And so if you're trying to use a tree in a diagnostic sense, then that also feels like, okay, well, there probably needs to be some numbers in there for that to take place. But yeah, I don't know if you've seen that as well.
Yeah, I see what you're getting in there. So yeah, so there are also, let's say, I guess, multiple levels of the metrics tree, because there is one version of it is, let's say, a pure graphical thing, a Figma graph or a Miro graph, or something that you draw by hand with boxes and arrows that says, here's revenue at the top, and it has these components, and this component, let's say new ARR, has number of leads times the conversion rate, and number of leads is like whatever you feed into the marketing times that conversion rate, and so on and so forth. So when you build something like that, it's just more like a show and tell type of thing. It's not dynamic. There's no data behind it. There's no refreshability, right? There's no it's not a tool that you are using to diagnose or run the business. But what I call that a KPI tree versus the real thing, a metric tree, like,
yeah,
call it whatever
you're
you
kind of
want.
getting into semantics. Yeah,
I think it's semantics. And I also think that you should, by all means, start with a graphical thing, a simple boxes and arrows thing, where you can actually put, here's the conversion rate. You can put text in there, and you can say, here's what I want to build. And by the way, like, you could walk into the CFO's office or the CEO's office with something like that and say, hey, have I captured everything here? I often, and we can get into this later, I often recommend people go to the CFO, grab the P&L, the profit and loss, and like try to turn that into a metrics tree. It's sort of like the easiest way to get started. And then if you want to like implement the tree, then it's a much bigger undertaking, because first you have to model the data that comes in, you have to build the metrics themselves, then you have to like connect them with each other to sort of build. And there are almost no tools that I've seen that sort of help you build, other than like Count is a very good example of this, because you can calculate one thing here and then connect it to this other thing, and then so this is one way to make it like real or live or refreshable, like if you want to think about it in those terms. So I personally, I sort of like overload the definition of the concept, where I say it's a metrics tree if I see a graphical thing that somebody puts on a board with marker, or if it's a Figma thing or Miro thing, or if it's like the thing that actually refreshes, like something that you build in a BI tool, right?
Yep.
Your BI tool of choice. So yeah, that's how I think about that.
Yeah, I like that. And just real quick, I saw Natasha has a question. I think we'll come back to it when we get closer to this topic, if that's okay. But I did want to call out that there is a Q&A section if you guys have questions. It's kind of hidden in Google Meets. If you go into activities and then Q&A, you can find it there. So if you do have questions, please drop them in there, and I'm keeping an eye on them as we go. So don't be afraid to do that. Okay, I think that's great. I think we're circling around a good definition of metric trees. I'm happy with this. And I think based on that, we've also touched a bit on how we see them used, but I think maybe it might be worth kind of painting this picture, because this is another point that I get a few questions of like, oh, is this do I no longer have to build dashboards because this metric tree is now going to be the answer? Is this now, we don't need analysts because this is now going to replace all the diagnostics that the data team is doing? Or, how should someone be thinking about it in terms of how it sits with how does the data team be thinking about it?
So one thing that you talked about earlier, it was sort of like the history behind the tree, and I want to just briefly talk about that, and then we can go into what it is and what it looks like. So when I met with Abi, who is sort of like at least in my mind, he's the originator of the metric trees. He mentioned that he got the idea from something called the DuPont analysis, DuPont tree, or however you want to call it. So DuPont, back in the, I think, 50s or 60s, they wanted a formula. There was one engineer who came up with the formula to calculate the return on equity, ROE. And the way that they represented this, so it's like this, like multiple equations, multiple ratios that are multiplied with each other, and they represented it as a graph with ROE at the very top, and then its components, going all the way down to the elements. So Abi took that idea and said, "Oh, I can probably put this around metrics, right? So I can take the key metric, let's say new ARR or just ARR or MRR for the business, for a SaaS company, and connect it all the way down to the levels that I can potentially control, like the leaf nodes, as opposed to these intermediary nodes." And so the moment that I saw that, I was immediately captured. I was like, oh, I could have, when I was an analyst, I could have, if I had known this, I would have probably succeeded and remained an analyst instead of becoming a data engineer, because I hated being an analyst, having to answer all those questions. And so then I found connections to other trees, other types of trees, because trees are very popular for decomposing a problem. And I will briefly mention one. So from Theory of Constraints, which you may be familiar with, the book The Goal by Eli Goldratt, he created these thinking processes, which are these logical trees that break down a problem into components, and eventually you try to find the root cause. One of these trees, because there's several, there's like the current reality tree, which is also known as the problem tree, and et cetera, et cetera. So one of these, where I immediately saw the connection with the metrics tree, is known as the goal tree. So the goal tree has not that many levels. So the top level is your goal, what you want to achieve. Then the next level are your critical success factors. So these are the factors that you need to achieve the goal. Now, if you think about the metric tree, the goal is your top metric, and then the critical success factors are the elements that make up that goal. ARR, you have new, you have resurrected ARR, you have churn, et cetera, et cetera. And then underneath these critical success factors, you have these multiple levels of necessary conditions that need to be in place in order for the critical success factor to become true, in order for you to reach the goal. So I was like, oh wow, this is basically a goal tree, but with metrics. So that's another kind of um, another link to say the past and sort of some kind of theory behind this.
Hmm.
And then another one, and this is the last one that I'll mention, is something that I saw done by a consultant, uh, but where he called it the profit tree. So if you search for profit tree, you'll find this article, and it's about, this website is about learning how to create these business cases, right, for consultants. But it's exactly the same thing. You take profit, you decompose it into costs and income, and then you decompose each into until you reach the very end. And one of the key elements of the profit tree, or these trees in general, is something known as MECE, or MECE.
Hmm.
I think stands for like mutually exclusive, collectively exhausting. So the idea is that each element is exclusive by itself, and then collectively they exhaust everything. So just wanted to kind of paint a fuller picture
Mm.
around the trees. Then to come back to your question about whether, do they replace dashboards, or do they replace the data team, etc. I don't think so. I think dashboards, the only problem I have with dashboards is that there's just too many of them the companies build. It's too easy to build, so everybody wants a dashboard, when in reality what they need is just an export of some data into Excel that they can use for something. In fact, there's another concept known as the dashboard tree, where it's sort of like this goal tree, but the dashboard tree contains metric trees inside.
Yeah.
The idea is you only have maybe 10 or 15, not more than 20 dashboards for the whole company. Each dashboard represents each dashboard represents a tree, and then it's highly curated, so that when a leader is looking at it, they can sort of say, oh, okay, so the problem, let's say, to do diagnostics, it appears to be this particular branch. And then someone in the data team can go and look at the metrics tree and actually decompose it further and figure out where the problem occurred.
Hmm.
Because in my experience, the leadership doesn't care about the details of the metrics tree, so somebody has to care, and
Yeah.
that's where the data team comes in. And in Abhi's experience, the metrics tree and then the dashboard tree sort of become like the source of truth, right? So you as a data team, your goal is to ensure the accuracy of this. And so I think this answers one of the questions that I saw pop up, which is like, who owns the metrics tree?
Mm.
100% the data team. And I sort of I'm thought of saying that, like, data teams need to sort of collaborate with finance more, because finance is thinking about this type of stuff, but they just don't have the full picture of the business. They might have some very high level numbers of revenue and income, and here's that. But oftentimes finance people and FP&A people, finance planning and analysis, they just don't have the access that a data team has to like all the data in the business. And so, like, if you collaborate with them, you make yourself a very powerful ally in the business. So who should own them? Yeah, it's got to be the data team. Do they remove the need for dashboards? No, they don't, but they do reduce the dashboard uh, sprawl, let's
Hmm.
call it,
Yeah.
right? And if once you add, so there's another piece to this, which is the weekly review, or the monthly review of these metrics. When you add that piece to it, where everybody is looking into on the dashboard tree and the metrics trees, and they're looking at the same exact aspect of reality, then you like everybody then sort of gets synchronized around the same things, and there's no need for additional questions, there's no need for additional dashboards. It's sort of like it reduces a lot of these questions, right?
Yeah.
And we can get into the specifics of like uh, why are there so many questions, because I mean I've done a lot of like thinking around that since I was the one getting all those questions.
Yeah.
But I'll pause there and
Yeah, I had a few thoughts in going through that. I think, yeah, I kind of picked up on a few more patterns as you were going through some of the other tree examples.
Mhm.
I think might be good to kind of pause and summarize in terms of, deciding what a tree is and what it isn't, and a metric tree specifically. I think, yeah, it seems like all these trees obviously have this concept of hierarchied information kind of laid out in this spatial structure. And there's also a diagnostic component to it. And therefore, I think there's also a kind of action-oriented kind of component to it. So, like, you should be able to do something with it. And I think to Nitesh, maybe part of the question, at least a bit, and we're going to cover in some of the later sessions in this masterclass of kind of how to choose metrics and how to have that process, because that can be really messy. I think a good rule of thumb is like it should be something that's actionable. Like you can't have a node in this tree that's just kind of abstract and like that's just the concept.
Yeah, I mean, you can measure pretty much anything with data these days, and a lot of the question then becomes, what should you measure, right? And so Abhi and I, mostly Abhi, created the Soma metrics, which is like an open source collection of metrics specifically for SaaS businesses, but a lot of them apply to other businesses as well. And these, because the idea that I had that he and I connected on was, hey, a lot of this data stuff could be standardized. Like a lot of this data stuff is done ad hoc, where somebody wants to measure something and then they put the request onto the data team, and then the data team is basically like an order taker, like an IT help desk. I sometimes like to call it like the data help desk, because it's unfortunate, but that's how it has been cast, I guess, in a lot of organizations. But the data team can take a more proactive role here, where they can say, hey, here's the metrics that we should use. Like you can go to like the GitHub Soma page and get all the metrics and say, here's the ones that I think we should be measuring in our business. And then you build the tree, and then you sort of basically become more proactive, and you help to answer a lot of the questions. Did I capture? Did I answer your question, or was that going in a wholly different direction?
No, it's good. Yeah, I think, yeah, we've covered off, I think, where some of the origin points of data trees or metric trees. I think we've covered kind of how people can expect to use them in the context of the rest of like dashboards and how it relates to the data team.
Right. So
go ahead.
that reminds me, because you've mentioned this a couple of times and I don't think I have addressed it. So the purpose of the metrics tree, or one of the purposes of the metrics trees, which they're perfect for, is what I like to call debugging the business. You call it diagnosing the business. Abhi sometimes call it diagnosing the patient, right? Because you're like, here's a business that's not growing as fast as the owners or the CEO or whomever wants it to grow, or the business is potentially, shrinking as opposed to growing. And you want to diagnose why. You want to figure out what's going on. And a lot of the times, you just have these high grain metrics such as revenue, or how much money you spend on marketing. And a tree decomposes a lot of these things into elements that you can not only measure, but you can also look at and see how they trend over time. So you can say, oh, hey, by the way, this marketing campaign that we were spending X number of dollars per month, it has started dipping in performance, and it's sort of taking with it a lot of our a lot of the rest of the metrics, because this thing is down 20%, revenue is down 20% or more.
Mhm.
And so now but why do you know? Because you have this full path built out in the tree. You have the dependencies of all these different elements, right? And so diagnosing the business or debugging the business is sort of the primary use case. But things don't stop there, because now you also want to figure out, how do I grow the business? Um, and you might want to say, uh, for example, when I was speaking to a CFO a couple of years back, they were asking me, "Hey, I have $100,000 to invest in marketing this year. Where do I put it? I want to grow my subscriber base to, let's say, 100,000 people or 50,000 people. Right now, I'm at 20,000, and my budget is 100,000. Solve the problem."
Yeah.
How would you solve something like that, right? And a lot of the times it's the finance people that are asking these questions, right? They want to know, I want to grow this business. Or let's say you raised 5 million, right? Now you want to know, how do you deploy it? How do you best deploy this money to fuel growth? Maybe the CEO is open-minded and is asking this question, as opposed to saying, let's just hire more headcount in sales, or let's hire more headcount in marketing. You as a data person can say, hey, our sales numbers are actually doing really, really well, and our capacity over there is being underutilized. So I don't think we should invest in sales. We should invest in marketing, particularly this marketing channel, because we've run a few experiments. We've seen very good response. We just need more fuel to that fire, right? We think that, like, there's a fire there. There's a potential growth opportunity. So we've run some, like, okay, if we don't know, we run some experiments. But if we do know, now is the time to fuel that growth. And you can also sort of fuel that growth in stages, and you can sort of see, okay, is it working? Because a lot of these things follow, I think it's a logarithmic curve. So you kind of like grow up to a point, then you hit
Yes, plateau. Yeah.
the plateau. It's not like a linear or exponential, which is like the opposite, but it's more like you grow, and then you kind of like hit some saturation point. And at that point, you might want to like switch tactics, so you can't just take all the money and dump it in one place and expect it to kind of give you this like linear growth. So these are sort of the two use cases. You have the diagnosing element, but then you also have this like growth side, which is,
Yeah.
find me the levers,
Yeah.
run a simulation. And there was an article that I read from Duolingo, where they ran simulations to figure out how to increase their DAU, the daily active users, and they didn't have past data, so they ran some simulations, and they kind of used data science, etc., to kind of figure out, okay, this is exactly what we need to do.
Mm.
And then they just said, okay, yeah, this is what we should do, and they did it, and it actually gave them so that's sort of the other use case, which is very rarely talked about, which is can I use the tree to find levers to influence these key, let's say, leaf nodes, right?
Yeah.
Or which ones of these nodes should I be targeting that would give me the most, say, bang for my dollar. So that's the other aspect of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really well said. Those two, yeah, from a diagnostic perspective and then from a growth perspective. And I'm curious, there's one other, one data leader I spoke to who kind of speaks to this objective of a data team as a connecting force. Like, it connects the understanding of the business to everyone, to make sure everybody has the same understanding of what the business is, how it's working, and also their contribution to it. And I felt like that was such an understated, or like something we forget that a data team is in such a position to do. And I feel like when I first came upon metric trees, it had a similar thought to you, I think, which is like, oh, if I had this as an analyst, it would be great. But also, if I had this just in my previous job, I might have known what I was supposed to be doing. Like I might have been able to connect this vague general objective that was 3 levels above me to what I'm doing today. And I think that's such a it's abstract, I guess, but it feels really important to get that right.
No, you make a very good point, because when I was a business analyst, I was sort of the nexus of a lot of departments. Like I was talking to sales, I was talking to marketing, I was talking to operations, to finance, and they were all asking for different, let's say, slices or cuts of the data based on their own department or the thing that they're mostly paying attention to, and their thinking is very siloed because they're just focused on, they got blinders on. They're like, I need to improve my ROI. Let's say I'm a CMO or VP of marketing, I got to improve my ROI, I got to improve my CAC, my customer acquisition cost, etc., etc. So they're just focused on that one thing. But you, as a data person, you get to see that this CAC connects all the way to revenue like this. So you could basically tell the marketing department to say, hey, if you can reduce CAC by X%, you can increase your revenue by Y%. Like you can give them that equation, if you will. Like this. That is a critical sort of a skill, or something that I don't think a lot of data teams get to see, because a lot of companies now follow the dispersed model of data, where they put analysts in all the different departments and everybody becomes like narrow focused on their particular area of expertise. But I think there's value to integrating the different views. And then another thing that I want to point out, which is another one of Abi's things, is that when it comes to these dashboards that you create, the dashboard tree and the metrics tree, you don't want to provide a dynamic view. A lot of the stuff that you've been taught as a data analyst or whatever is like, provide as many slices, buttons, charts, etc., as possible, so people can look at things from multiple perspectives. You don't want that, because then everybody is looking at the different slice of reality, and you're saying, we're growing on this segment by Y%, and then somebody's saying we're shrinking in this other segment by Y%, by X%. And so people then are just like at odds with each other, as opposed to you curating the view to like for everybody. So Abi prefers these static views. So he's like, the data team should curate the most important segments and slices, and like by channel, for example, or by region, and only provide those. So like the data team takes even a more crucial, more important role as the curator of the stuff. Like you're not just a service provider, but you actually provide a critical role to the company to sort of weed out the noise and point everybody towards the signal. At least that's what I want to get data teams to do with a lot of my writing, a lot of my thinking about metric trees.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think it's helpful to think about it as, if you do want this to be a good diagnostic tool and to be used by so many different parts of the business, it does have to be consistent, it has to be trusted, and then you find a different way to help people, well, why did that go down? Okay, well then let's separately go explore that and figure that out. But this isn't the place where you're doing that kind of interrogation and filtering. This is the single source of truth, so this is going to stay as it is.
Yes.
I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
Cool. I wanted to make sure we had some time for questions. So I'm going to ask you one more question.
Okay.
And while I do that, if anybody else has some questions they want to add to the Q&A, now's a good time. And Yeah, the one thing I was going to ask is, what is one thing about metric trees that you wish you had known sooner?
The fact that they exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, to be honest, once I saw the tree concept itself, right? The company that I was working for when I was a business analyst, they didn't make like revenue numbers available, but they did have like a North Star metric, which was, number of bookings, let's say. And I I would just like people would I, I would go into the president's office and I would present, because they would do the quarterly update and they were trying to like put together all these different charts and like they're trying to create a narrative, right? Like you have all of these different elements, marketing and sales and this and that and the other, and the tree itself, the idea of this like graphical representation of the business with the hierarchy and the dependencies and the different levels and the different steps, that would have saved me a lot of turmoil in like answering these questions. Because hey, if I had the tree that mapped, all the way from bookings down to marketing efforts, down to sales efforts, down to operations efforts, I could then come up with levers, because they were always looking to grow, but they couldn't figure out, and a lot of the experiments were done randomly, ad
Yeah.
hoc. Sometimes they would run one experiment and then just change it halfway through before you had collected enough data. I know a lot of people get frustrated with that one. So I just wish that I knew that I could do this, right? Um, I just wish that I knew that this sort of thing was possible, that I could then influence the business. I find myself that I like the business side quite a bit. Um, I've always stood between, when it comes to the business and, let's say, the tech side. I've never been a hardcore techie, and I've never been like a hardcore business person. Always sat in the middle. And I think being a business analyst with a tool like a metrics tree would have given me so much more standing, probably, more promotions, more influence within the org. So yeah, yeah, I wish I had known about them sooner.
Yeah.
And and then the diagnostic part, I think is the second point of that. So I have spent hours, if not days and days, of trying to figure out why this one thing went down in the past, X period.
Hmm.
Marketing would come in and say, hey, we've spent this much money here. This thing is down as a compared to some other period by X%. Why? What happened? And having to do that analysis over and over again from scratch, very frustrating. Yeah, I would save my SQL queries for the next time, but then you would go in, you like, what did I run first? And every time it was something else. If I'd had the tree, it'd be like, oh, boom, boom, boom. Okay, it's down to this branch. It's over here, and I could diagnose these problems before they occur. Basically, the moment that something started to go amiss, I would be able to alert the team, be more proactive, and be more valued in the company. So yeah, I think that's that.
That's good. Yeah, I think it's also a good way to sense check some of those questions that you get of like, oh, they're asking about this thing that is, clearly in this tree of information is
Yeah,
such an irrelevant point to what the objective is. So to be like, oh, actually, do you want to be asking about this? Like maybe this is
right.
more of a thing. Yeah, it's a good sense
Exactly.
check there as well.
Yes.
Okay, great. We've got some questions. You ready to dive
Ready.
in?
Ready
Okay,
to
I'm
go.
gonna read them off. Nitesh started us off. I'm very curious to understand how you'd recommend breaking down and building a metric tree, given all metrics are not equal. I remember reading about MECE, which you already mentioned, but I'd love to know if you have a recommended framework for doing this.
I don't have a framework. I have sort of a methodology. I don't know if it's like the same thing, but it's more like a rough guide. And the rough guide is start at the top. Start at the top, which is the goal. And a lot of the times, let's say for SaaS companies, that goal is recurring revenue. Sometimes it's like new bookings, but let's say recurring revenue. It's a lot easier to work your way downwards because you can, at any one level, you can keep going until you reach the very end where you say, okay, here's like money that I put into this one campaign and outcome leads. I can't go any further. So this is my leaf node, but then I have everything built out. So work backwards from the goal is my recommendation. Now, that could be like a massive sort of effort. So the dashboard tree has much more like fixed elements, and people can Google that. And I think you can go to Abi's article. So at the top, you might have like these metrics, but then down on one side, you might have just sales. And then let's say that you can build a metrics tree just about sales. And let's say that the key metric at the top of sales is sales qualified leads or something like that. It could be revenue if it's a CRO, but like everybody kind of cares about, let's say, sales qualified leads. You can start there and work your way down to marketing spend and agent or account executive numbers, etc. So it's like you can feed a lot of that stuff into the tree, but you can never work like from the bottom to the top. You always have to work downwards and like I said, you can take any one goal that you care about. Marketing could maybe just cares about MQLs, and MQLs fits into another tree, but let's say they only care about MQLs, so they could build just that tree that says, okay, I'm going to influence MQLs. And you as a data team might know that, if you influence MQLs by this much, you influence revenue by this much. And in marketing, let's say that they know that, and then they just say, okay, I'm going to focus on just that one. So work backwards.
I think, Nitesh, one thing I'd add is on next Tuesday, the session that we have planned with the guys from Bumble, Clio, and Mubi. So they've each done this in a slightly different way, and some of them do it like Ergest said, like by department, and then some do it starting from the very top and working their way down, and each of them has kind of a different way that they've done that. So I recommend we'll definitely cover that on Tuesday. Excuse me. And I would just say it's always very iterative as well.
Yes.
Sorry, cough attack. Next question is from Angelita. She asked, who should own the metric tree asset and how to keep it up to date in a non-centralized environment? I think you've covered this a bit, but do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, so a lot of this stuff becomes murky because tools for this don't exist at the moment. But the assets don't, I mean, so the data team is already in charge of, let's say, the DBT models or some kind of like the data models and the data and the platform. They're in charge of, many of them are in charge of ETLs. That could be data engineering team separate. And then they're in charge of the dashboards. So I think it should be, I mean, it's different for every company, right? But in my opinion, and I think Abi's opinion, is like the data team should own this 100% and sort of be responsible for it. If you have read Amazon's this book, Working Backwards, that has a chapter on analytics, Amazon does something they call the Weekly Business Review or the WBR, and Cedric Chin has written quite a bit about that. They believe they sort of they put finance as the team in charge of the metrics, as someone who has like no like Switzerland, right? They have no bias. They have no they didn't go one way or another way. So they're in charge of metric definitions and things like that. So I mean, it's different for every company. You can see what other people have done. I think the upcoming like call that you have, or the upcoming workshop that you have, I think would be very useful, because people want to see examples and then generalize from those examples to their own thing. So it's like, yeah, I mean, those are guidelines. They're not rules or laws of any kind.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, yeah, seeing a few examples of how other people have done it, and yeah, some people kind of go the finance route. There'll be examples of that next week, and some other flavors as well. So yeah, also good ones come next week. Okay. Oh, we've got quite a few questions. I hope you've got time. So the next one is from Anonymous. Do you have any recommendations on how best to get buy-in from business stakeholders? I'll also preface this by saying this is a big thing that we're going to cover on Tuesday. But if you've got anything to add, Ergest.
Yeah, this is the question, right? Because I have seen that without some kind of leadership buy-in, this is impossible to sort of do in a grassroots way. I would say, if I could just summarize it in one, at least rule of thumb, is like, find yourself an ally, someone who's interested in this sort of stuff. Ideally, someone in the C-suite, like somebody in the executive board, or someone who has some measure of influence slash, let's talk about these soft things like power, etc., in an org. But finding yourself someone like that who will support your efforts and sort of take your pleas onto the executive board is like, if you can get them bought in, then they can sort of get everybody else bought in. But other than that, you have to pitch. You have to pitch the benefits of something like this to the executive board. And it's like, it's one of those things that is like, yeah, you have to get buy-in somehow. And buy-in is like, hey, by the way, if I do this, right, if we do it this way, then we will reduce costs on our data infrastructure. We will reduce costs of like needing to hire more analysts because we have a lot of questions. And we will potentially apply resources better. Like we're actually, we can show results to let's say the investors, right? If it's a startup, or to the shareholders if it's a public company.
I think one thing also to add to keep in mind when you're doing this process is like thinking about it. And a couple of the business leaders I've spoken to talk about this kind of mental gymnastics that you have to go through to just maintain in your head the mental model of what's happening. And I think that's really draining and exhausting, and they never feel like they're doing a very good job. So I think there's always this kind of need for something like this to just remove that that gymnastics that they're having to do to keep track of everything, because they're just getting pinged with numbers all over the place, and they're like, I don't know how that affects what I'm doing. So
reducing complexity, reducing noise.
Like there is a big need there that you can meet, and I think if you find a way to meet that anxiety that's there, then they're going to take it out of your hand as soon as possible. Yes, there's another question about sponsorship, which I think we covered. Just going through these, make sure I'm not asking repeats. Okay, another anonymous question. In a decentralized setup where each business unit creates its own driver metric tree for their North Star metrics, how can we assure a standardized approach is followed across all units rather than having each unit build a tree based on their individual understanding?
That comes down to like org politics, like finding someone who is willing to kind of unify all of those pieces. Oftentimes that's finance, right? So like, you put finance in charge of making sure that the metric definitions are the same across the board. And you then sort of mandate that from the top. I don't think I've seen, I mean, unless you can persuade the CEO, right? But you still have to persuade the CEO. It's like what I have worked with in the past is working directly with the leaders, the metric definitions and the document of like, here's what this thing means. Often this could be in the tree itself, and you can sort of hover it and you can say, okay, this is the definition, and this is, you can click on it and you can see the metric. But I do need to drop, Taylor. I'm getting
Okay.
into a meeting.
Okay, no worries. I'll wrap up here. Thank you, Ergest. I appreciate
Thanks.
it.
Bye.
Sorry for the abrupt ending there, but I'll do my best to answer these, and I'll also send them over to Ergest as well, and include them in the notes, his responses to that. So I think I'll just go ahead and do that. I'll end it there. After this, I will send a recording out as well as some notes, including all the references. Ergest referenced quite a few books and concepts and things like that. So make sure you have all those materials as well as the answers to these questions. I'll be on for a few more minutes if you've got any questions about anything, but otherwise, hopefully see you guys on Thursday. We'll be doing building a metric tree live, where we'll be touching on some of these questions in terms of, do metrics need to add up to 100%? Do they need to be exhaustive? All those kinds of things. How do you approach that? So yeah, thank you everyone for coming.